Hi, I'm Brian O'Day, and this is Creepy Canada. On today's program, we go to Greensburg, Pennsylvania, to investigate reports of Bigfoot sightings and the notion that these creatures arrived here on a spacecraft.
And we'll bring you the story of the Dungarvan Hooper, who haunts the woods of Miramichi in New Brunswick, Canada.
West Pennsylvania is known for its beautiful farmlands and lakes, but in the early 1970s, this area became known for something else, an outbreak of UFO sightings that has never been rivaled. And coincidentally, something else made an appearance in the Pennsylvania woods. The two events established a link between UFOs and Bigfoot that had never been dreamed of.
How the events of 1973 unfolded pertaining to the Bigfoot outbreak was that I had received a call from a relative of this gentleman who had been the witness to this event. And what I learned was that on this particular night, this gentleman was shaving, and he was in the bathroom, he was cleaning up, and he turned around, and for whatever reason, he was looking at the window, and at the window were these two large glowing red eyes that were staring at him. And he was quite shocked. He turned around, knocked some things over, ran out into the other room to call some of the other family members, and they all smelled this unusual odor they described like rotten cucumber, a very strong odor. And it was very unusual enough to see these glowing eyes staring at him in the window, but when everybody went outside and when I went there later and looked at the window, it was 8 feet off the ground. So what was it that was so tall that it was able to get its eyes up to that height?
Bigfoot, Yeti, Sasquatch. It's easy to dismiss the idea of a giant ape-like humanoid. It seems more cartoon than reality. But a series of events in Pennsylvania in 1973 changed a lot of people's minds about the existence of these creatures. What's even more intriguing is the evidence that suggests these creatures may come from another planet.
I was so scared. I was in the bathroom shaving.
Bigfoot researcher Stan Gordon interviewed the couple shortly after they reported the sighting. He was convinced of their sincerity and honesty. They had clearly experienced something terrifying.
Similar, and I didn't believe it.
As further proof of what they'd seen, they called in their son,
Come in here, please.
who claimed he'd seen a monster in the nearby woods.
Sometimes I didn't know what to make of it.
At first, the parents hadn't taken him seriously, but now it didn't seem so unlikely.
Sam, I don't know. I hope this Mr. Gordon can help us figure out what it was that's out in the woods. It's terrifying.
This particular sighting occurred outside of Greensburg, and this was the first event that we had, and it was the first of many, many reports that would happen over the next several months over a widespread area here in Pennsylvania.
The boy took Stan Gordon out to the woods, where he said he'd seen this monster. After a quick investigation of the area, Stan Gordon made a remarkable discovery: a fresh footprint. The boy said he'd been walking home, taking a shortcut through the brush, when he heard what he thought was a deer in the bushes. He threw some sticks into the bushes to try and flush the animal out. But what appeared was no deer. It was a creature, at least 8 feet tall, carrying a fence post. He stood over the boy, who was frozen in terror at what he was seeing. Apparently more curious than angry, the creature turned and walked off into the woods.
We have a track out in the woods. Oh, you have something back there?
For Stan Gordon, the footprint would be an important piece of evidence.
And this is the track that we found up there behind the hill. As you can see, it's three-toed. It's 13 inches long and 8 inches wide. And you can see the muscle tone, the bone structure in it. Very, very detailed track. Now, this one was colorized for television. But very intriguing because other locations turned up very similar tracks during that time. And even years later, very similar tracks have shown up throughout Pennsylvania and, in fact, other parts of the country as well. There were sightings being reported from 7 counties in southwest Pennsylvania. We also began to find that there apparently have been other sightings prior to this Greensburg report, but a lot of people were very reluctant to report it until they started hearing more people talking about it. And so this has been going on for a longer period of time than we had any idea of.
I was in the bathroom shaving.
For Stan Gordon and his team, the incident at Greensburg, Pennsylvania was just the beginning, and they had more questions than answers. Suddenly, there were so many reports of Bigfoot sightings, some from such credible witnesses that law enforcement officials had to take it seriously. Where were these creatures coming from? Stan Gordon's next investigation found a link that no one had anticipated.
One of those particular cases came in from about 50 miles from the Greensburg area up in Beaver County. And this particular case involved 2 teenage girls. They were in a rural area, and they were waiting for somebody to take them somewhere. They were waiting for a ride. And as they are standing there in this wooded area, this very large, hairy creature, man-like creature with long arms and covered with hair, walked across the road into the woods.
Do you see it?
The sighting of the creature was strange enough, but what they said was that the creature had in its one hand a small glowing sphere of light. They talked to the one girl's father, and according to them, he went down into the woods, was down there for quite a while.
Hurry, Dad. In the woods, that way. Be careful.
While this was all going on, an object came across the sky, hovered over the area, and projected a beam of light down into that wooded area.
What is that? Oh my gosh.
So here again is something very intriguing. You've got a creature carrying a glowing sphere of light and some unusual object in the sky projecting a beam of light down in the same general area. And this began again as one of a number of cases we are to investigate that began to make us wonder what it was we were dealing with.
Dad! Come back!
According to one of the researchers that looked into the case and having talked with the 2 young women who were involved, apparently when the father went down on the woods, he was down there for a period of time. When he came up, he appeared to be somewhat shaken over the event. And when he came back out, he really didn't want to talk about it, and he basically said he didn't want anybody going down into those woods and that some things are better left alone. And it was actually the first case that I recall during that time where people reported both a UFO and a Bigfoot at the same place and time. In some other instances during this wave of sightings in '73, we, for example, in a particular area, we'd have a UFO sighting, and then sometimes within hours or days later, we'd have a Bigfoot show up and vice versa. But while it is very apparent that there are some in the Bigfoot field that don't want to hear about the UFO phenomenon being involved, and a lot of people with UFOs don't want to hear about the Bigfoot phenomenon being involved, that isn't our position. We got out to investigate these reports as the incidents were being reported, and this is what took place, and we're just documenting the information, trying to find the answers ourselves to what we're dealing with. Reports began to come in from a widespread area of sightings of these large, hairy Bigfoot-type creatures. And my phones in my home, my UFO control center, the operation center, was operated out of my house. And of course, all the people involved in my group were volunteers. And as more activity began to take place, more of these people began to spend day and night here answering the phones and working the radio communication center here to dispatch our investigators out. And it got to the point where there was so much going on, so much activity, that I took some time off from my full-time job where I was operating a small little electronics firm here locally to spend full time out in the field just going out there to investigate these sightings firsthand. And I can tell you, if I hadn't been directly involved in this investigation myself, it'd be very hard for me to believe some of the events that were taking place.
When we come back, a documented link between Bigfoot and UFO sightings.
Between June 1973 and February 1974, there were an extraordinary number of UFO sightings in the skies over Pennsylvania. Reports were coming in by the hundreds. And, almost as frequently, a Bigfoot-type creature was seen in the same area at the same time. Were these two phenomena linked?
There's no doubt that the most interesting case that we investigated during the outbreak of Bigfoot sightings in 1973, and probably one of the most classic cases on record, occurred on the night of October 25th, 1973 in Fayette County outside of the city of Uniontown, Pennsylvania. What we learned was at about 9 p.m. that evening, Stephen and his wife were in the truck and they were proceeding down the farm lane towards his father's farm when they observed this large red sphere about as big as a barn, about 100 feet up in the sky. And as they got closer, they realized some other family members were seeing it. They called up to a neighbor, and the neighbor and their family went outside. So totally about 15 people observed this large red sphere that was slowly dropping towards the pasture field. So the farmer's son and I believe it was his wife, they went up to the neighbor's house where they all could still see it. And he and two neighbor boys decided they were going to proceed up to that pasture area to see exactly what this thing was. So Stephen goes back to the father's farmhouse and grabs some ammunition. He grabbed a handful of ammunition, which turned out to be 2 tracers and 3 live rounds of ammunition, and they also picked up a single extra bullet and put it in his pocket. So they proceeded up towards the pasture field. They left their truck with the headlights on, angled on the hill so they could see as they were walking up that incline. And as they got up to the top of the pasture, the object was about 250 feet away and was apparently sitting very close or right on the ground. And the object now looked like a large, bright white, half a hemisphere, like half a bubble. And it was sitting on the ground. It was luminescent. It was illuminating the whole area. There was this high-pitched sound, he said, similar to like a lawnmower, which they could hear. And also, as they were approaching the area, they were also hearing a sound that was like loud baby crying sounds as well. Their attention is drawn to about 75 feet away along a fence line, where they're seeing these 2 large figures moving along the fence line in their direction. The one figure they estimated was about 9 feet tall. The other one was close to around 7 feet tall. They could estimate this also from the fence posts that were made up of old railroad ties and about 6 feet tall that had been put into the ground. Now, at first they thought they were bear, and they realized that these things are bipedal. They're walking upright. They're covered with long, dark, matted hair. And these creatures have these very bright green eyes that are glowing. The one boy becomes very, very upset, and he tells Stephen to shoot at them. And finally, Stephen fires his first round, which was a tracer, so it was just a bright flash. And when he fired the tracer, the larger of the 2 creatures made this crying sound. He fired the second tracer. And when he fired the second tracer, the larger of the 2 creatures reached out as though to grab at that tracer round. And he said at the exact moment that the creature went to grab at that tracer, suddenly the object in the field disappeared. It didn't take off, it didn't leave, it just suddenly vanished. The light went out, all the high-pitched sound it was making suddenly stopped. And he said even the area around the neighborhood, like the dogs soon after that, they became very quiet. And the 2 creatures slowly turned around and began to walk back towards the opposite direction, towards the wooded area. Well, at that point, the one boy had already run out of the area. He was pretty upset, and he had 3 live rounds of ammo, and he fired right into them. And he said he's sure he hit the largest one. He said it sounded like a bullet hitting water, but there was no indication that the creatures were harmed in any way. So after watching the creatures moving away in the distance, Stefan and the other young boy, they went back to their vehicle, drove back to the farmhouse. They took some of those people from that farmhouse to the neighbor's house where they called the state police. And it was about 9:45 when the state trooper arrived at the scene. And when the trooper got there, he said, "I'm here to investigate the flying saucer." And Stefan said, "Forget about it. You're going to think we're nuts, so just don't worry about investigating." The trooper said, "I have to investigate it. We had a report of 2 similar creatures seen on the mountain last night, so I had to follow up on the investigation." So they get into the state police car, and they go up towards the pasture. And they get out of the vehicle, and they proceed over to the area where the object had been resting on the ground. And to the surprise of the state trooper, the whole area was now self-luminescent and glowing. The state trooper said it was about 100 to 150 feet in diameter. The animals, he noticed, wouldn't go anywhere near that glowing area. He shined his flashlight beam down into it, and he said he could barely see the beam of light from the brightness coming off this luminous area. He said it appeared to be a little warmer in temperature inside of that glowing space as well. And he said if he had a newspaper, he could have sat down within that glowing area and read a newspaper from the light that was coming off of it. So he was quite surprised as to what he was seeing and quite baffled about it. And Stefan was getting a little more upset. And at one point he made the comment that, "Look, I don't get paid for being brave. I'm getting out of here." And they went and left that spot, proceeded over towards the edge of the woods along the fence line when they'd seen the creatures. And at one point, they heard something heavy walking. And they would stop, they'd hear a couple steps, they would move, it would move, and they were both becoming a little nervous, feeling that there was something close by. Now, at this point, they heard this noise ahead of them.
What is that?
Stefan reached in his pocket, he had 1 bullet left,
I'm gonna shoot it.
and he fired right into this thing. He said when he hit it, the thing charged at the fence. The 2 fellas jumped into the police car and got out of there. They radioed to the barracks that they were coming in, and the state police dispatcher kind of made a comment, "You see a little men out there, any Martians out there," something along that line, and the trooper said there's definitely something here. So when they got back to the state police barracks, they were both separately put in 2 separate rooms. They were both separately interviewed, and after that interview is when the state trooper contacted my hotline and requested a team be sent to the site.
Well, I never saw one before. This thing was huge. It was big. It had to be...
When we come back, checking radiation levels at the mysterious glowing circle. Stefan, a Pennsylvania farmer, had one of the most amazing UFO and Bigfoot encounters in history, and a state trooper had verified the encounter. Now it was up to Stan Gordon and his team to investigate these events.
All right, George, well, I'm just headed down the highway.
We got up there in the early morning hours, and the first thing we did when we met Stefan was we checked him in the area for radiation, found all the radiation levels were normal, this normal background radiation, looked around the area, noticed that the animal still wouldn't go anywhere near the glowing area where the object had been, but when we got there, the area was no longer glowing. And as we're up in that field looking around for other indications, other evidence, suddenly this very unusual strong wave, this unusual odor that I would describe as more like sulfur, rotten egg smell, permeated the air. And at that point, we got the witness out of there, and all of us got out of the area, not sure what exactly it was we were going to be dealing with.
But this was not the last significant case linking UFO activity to Bigfoot sightings that Stan and his team investigated during this strange 9-month period. There was one other remarkable incident which gave Stan more insight into the nature of these creatures.
There was an event that happened on the night of February 6, 1974, also in Fayette County near Ohio Pile, that may give us a clue as to why we haven't come up with any really solid evidence of some of the Bigfoot events being reported. What happened on that particular case, that evening, a woman who lived in a cabin out in a very wooded area near Ohio Pile, she had heard some noise out on her porch. It sounded like the rattling of tin cans. And there had been some wild dogs had been roaming that area for several weeks, and she figured the dogs were back. They're out on the porch. So she loaded her 16-gauge shotgun, and she was going to fire right over top of their head just to scare the dogs away. So what she did, she loaded one chamber, opened up the door of her porch, and went out in the doorway. And instead of the dogs being there, about 6 feet away, was this very large, hairy, man-like creature that was about 7 feet tall, about 6 feet away from her. As soon as she got outside, the creature raised its arms up over its head, and she had the feeling this thing was going to lunge at her, and she immediately fired, pulled the trigger and fired right at this creature. And she said what happened next was there was a bright flash of light, like somebody took a photograph, and suddenly the creature just disappeared. Well, that's not even the end of the story. She goes back in the house. She's very upset, not sure what she's dealing with here. And about 100 feet away, her son-in-law and the family lived in a trailer, and they heard the gunshot. So they called and said, what's going on up there? And she tried to explain to him. So her son-in-law grabbed his revolver, and he began to walk down the road towards her home.
Please hurry!
As he got closer to the cabin, he said 4 or 5 of these hairy creatures surrounded him, and he started shooting at them, and he ran into the cabin.
Who is it?
It's me, let me in.
Oh, oh,
Got here as soon as I could.
oh, I'm so scared. I didn't know what to do. The thing was out there. It was
know.
just dead. I was so scared.
I saw him outside. I shot at him.
Oh, did you hit him? Oh,
Look, we need to call the police.
here. Hold it on. Oh, please hurry. It's an emergency. We need your help. Please come right away.
So when he got into the cabin, they both looked out the window. He said also what was so unusual was, here's this bright object, almost like a Christmas ornament with red lights and other lights on it, flashing, hovering over the trees at the same time. Soon after the event occurred and they reported to the state police, a state trooper along with a National Guardsman arrived at that location to investigate. Now the reason the National Guardsman was with them that night is because at that particular time there was a national trucker strike going on, and there was gas rationing going on across the country. There had also been some reports of shootings and violence on the highway, so the National Guard in some states were patrolling with the state police, which was happening in Pennsylvania. So in that case, a state trooper and a National Guardsman arrived at the scene initially.
Well, thank God you're here.
Come on outside. Explain to me what happened out here, please. Please.
See, she heard a noise outside. She got the gun and she came out here.
And I
then...
saw this big hairy thing. He's just covered with hair. Wasn't he covered with hair?
Covered with hair.
These big feet. And I just raised my gun and I shot at it.
Do you think you hit him?
I don't know. He just disappeared.
You know what? Can you please go inside and we'll check the area out? Thank you. Let's check the area out over here, please.
Although the men searched all around the property, shining their flashlights into the shrubs and trees, and looking for footprints on the ground, they found nothing unusual.
Folks, we just did a perimeter check. We couldn't find anything out there, so what I suggest you do is stay in the house, keep everything locked. We'll come back in the morning and we'll do another search around the perimeter.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you for coming out.
Because of the gas shortage at the time, we were not able to get any gas to get up to that area, which was a pretty good distance away the night of the event. So we got up early the next morning and filled up the car, and we proceeded up towards Ohio Pile.
The lady claims that she came out onto the porch and started blasting over this direction. She said she got him. You hit him, it vanished. But I did find a shot in the tree over there, so let me show you this. All right, come on over here. Found it.
We found that pellet, that shot that she had fired at the creature embedded in one of the trees in the woods nearby.
What is it? A bullet hole, right over here. Look. Yeah.
Bigfoot sightings, of course, have been reported not only in Pennsylvania, but through many of the neighboring states throughout the United States and many parts of the world. And of course, the skeptics have always asked, well, if these things are really being seen out there, these unusual animals, why isn't there more physical evidence? And I have to agree. After having been involved in investigating hundreds of Bigfoot sightings over the years in Pennsylvania, talked to many, many credible witnesses, having seen some limited physical evidence out in the field, one has to wonder why, if these things are around and why people see them so, in some years, quite frequently, why hasn't somebody hit one with a car? Why haven't they found a dead body? Why haven't they found other stronger evidence out in the field than just some hair samples, some footprints occasionally? And if this lady's account is accurate about actually shooting one of these creatures at close range and it suddenly disappearing, well, now this brings in a whole different aspect of the case, something that we have to wonder what exactly it is we're dealing with.
The huge wave of Bigfoot and UFO sightings that had started the previous year now slowed down. Stan Gordon and his team now had hundreds of reports to go through, and many of them raised more questions than answers. But an even bigger question was raised by the discovery of another team of investigators, a man in a dark suit, accompanied by a military officer. After the break, was the U.S. government trying to discredit the Bigfoot and UFO sightings?
Back in the 1980s, when George Lutz and I were doing a follow-up investigation with Stefan about his event that happened in 1973, a very intriguing detail surfaced as we talked to him that day. We talked about the possibility of doing some hypnosis with him concerning certain aspects of that event back in 1973. He had not been hypnotized by any of our research group or any other people involved in the investigation that we know of back at that time. So anyhow, we talked to him about it during the mid-80s when we were there, and he looked at us and said,
You already did hypnosis.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, you sent two guys over, an army guy and a guy in a suit.
When was this?
Like 10 years ago.
Are you sure?
Positive.
They said that we sent them?
He said you sent him. He said your name. Guy in a suit said he knew you, Stan, that you told him to come hypnotize me.
That's impossible. It wasn't us.
Shortly after Stefan reported seeing the UFO and the ape-like creatures near it, he was visited by a man in a dark suit and a military officer.
We need to talk to you about this recent UFO sighting. We'd like some more information about what you witnessed the other night. Now, here are a few pictures we'd like to show you to see if anything matches what you saw.
During the interview that these two men had with Stefan, one of the men produced a briefcase, and out of the briefcase he pulled out a number of photographs which apparently were very intriguing to Stefan, because there were photographs of unidentified flying objects and Bigfoot-type creatures.
We're friends of Stan Gordon's.
And he talked to him for quite a while, and then the one gentleman said that they would like to hypnotize him. And I remembered that they pulled a large ring out, and they began to move it in front of his face over and over again, and apparently they did hypnotize him.
Backwards from 10.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. Shoot it! 3, 2, 1.
I want you to tell me everything you saw that night. Every single detail.
And when that was all over, they said that he wasn't crazy, that he saw what he saw, and that they would be in touch with him again. And that's the last time he ever heard from these people.
Thank you very much. We'll be in touch.
Who these men were that visited Stefan 2 or 3 weeks after the event happened, of course, is open to speculation. And, of course, the government got out of UFO investigations back in December of 1969 when the Air Force shut down Project Blue Book, which was their official investigating agency. So who these men were and why they had an interest in this case is something we still have no answer for.
After the break, more evidence of a government cover-up.
There were some other instances that happened during the many months that we were out in the field investigating these UFO and Bigfoot sightings that were going on. And that particular event that Stefan had mentioned to us that had taken place in '73 where the two men visited him was in fact not unique. We had got a call from a request from the police department up in Derry Township to send a team up there right away that another event had happened involving a close Bigfoot encounter at a trailer park up there. So we proceeded from Hermanley, PA, up to that trailer park up in Derry Township. When we got there, what we found out was that the people in the trailer had heard something scratching at the end of the trailer. And all of a sudden, their lights in the trailer began to go on and off. And the woman saw this very large, very broad-shouldered, dark creature running off to the other end of the trailer park. Another neighbor had called her because he had seen something very large by her electric meter. And when we investigated, we found that apparently this thing had pulled a large electrical wire from out of the ground, and that is what was causing the light to go on and off. So what happened was that several days later, I got a call from that woman who had been at that trailer park who had experienced that event, and she called to tell me that she had found some hair samples on the trailer that may be connected with the creature she had seen several days before. She was having trouble getting to me. She had to get the operator to break in as an emergency to get through because all the phone calls coming in to our hotline number at that time. And anyhow, what she called about, she was highly upset because a man had come to her trailer saying he was investigating the Bigfoot sightings in the area. She didn't know how he had even gotten her name. And he came down to her trailer, and she mentioned to him that she was trying to reach me, that she had these hair samples. And he said, well, he knew me, and he would take the samples to me.
Are you the one that saw the Bigfoot?
Yes, yes, I am.
Could I see you down here?
Oh, sure. Yes. Yes, we did over here. Well, I can show you this. First of all, we collected these hair samples.
I'm going to take this for
I also took this picture. You can't have that picture. That belongs to me.
I'd really like to have that back.
That doesn't belong to you.
investigation.
There's a footprint of him.
And also there was some other people right there at the trailer looking, some footprints. They had been found right near the trailer, looking around the area as well.
There's the footprint.
Then he went over to the footprints in the ground and began to destroy the footprints. At that point, the lady began yelling that, you know, who are you? What are you doing? I'm calling the police. And they said he ran out of there, ran back to his vehicle, which had an Ohio license plate, and almost turned over getting out of there at a high rate of speed. Now, who this fellow was, to this day, we don't know. And, of course, what happened to the hair samples is something that we'll probably never know. The wave of UFO sightings and the Bigfoot events that happened in 1973 were unprecedented. It was just an amazing series of events to live through. If I hadn't been involved out in the field personally investigating many of these cases, it would be very hard for me to accept and believe that some of these things occurred. But in so many of these instances, either myself or some other team members, we were out at the sighting location within minutes or hours after the event occurred. The evidence was still fresh. You could see the emotional reaction of the witnesses out there. And most intriguing, in many cases, you saw the animal reactions. People can be fooled, but animals can't. But the point is, this is something that's well documented. These cases could not be easily dismissed. And we hope someday that somebody out there will have an answer as to why these things were reported.
Does Bigfoot exist? Is it an as yet undiscovered species on Earth? Is it a creature from another planet? Could Bigfoot be a test animal created by aliens and put on Earth to gauge human reaction? Stan Gordon says he still gets reports of sightings to this day, and he and his team continue to collect evidence of Bigfoot's existence. Coming up next, the Whooping Ghost of Dungarvan, New Brunswick. Deep in the Dungarvan woods in northern New Brunswick, there's a ghost whose whooping cries are said to make a man's blood run cold. People say it's the angry spirit of a young man named Ryan Garvin, which has haunted the woods since the young man's grisly death in 1827.
The Dungarvan Whooper has probably been the best-known ghost in this area of the Miramichi in New Brunswick for more than a century. His otherworldly screams can be heard echoing through the forests. Some say it's the dying screams of Ryan Garvin, seeking revenge for what happened to him was horrible then, as it is today.
In the early 1800s, there was an insatiable demand for lumber to supply the maritime shipyards. Lumber camps sprang up all along the Dungarvan River. The loggers were men of all backgrounds, from farmers to ex-convicts. The men worked under dangerous conditions and spent their evenings cooped up in cramped cabins, often drinking and gambling away their wages. In 1827, young Ryan Garvin was hired on as a cook at one of these camps. A quiet man who kept to himself, Ryan didn't drink or gamble. He saved his wages to pay his mother's medical bills. Not long after Ryan joined the crew, a severe storm washed out the road, the only road in and out of the remote camp. Food supplies were very low, and nothing could get in. The lumberjacks, hungry after a day in the woods, grew irritable and aggressive and began to turn on the camp boss. One man even threatened that if he didn't get meat that very evening, he would kill and cook the camp boss. Fearing this was not an idle threat, the camp boss conceived of a ghastly plan. Alone with Ryan at the camp, he called to the reclusive young cook to meet him at the back of the cabin. Little did Ryan know that he was walking to his doom. After the break, a grisly meal for an unsuspecting crew. That evening, when the lumberjacks returned to camp, it was the camp boss and not Ryan who met them. The aroma of meat stew wafted through the air. The camp boss told the crew that Some supplies had been brought in by a messenger who had come to call Ryan home to tend his dying mother. What the crew didn't know was that the camp boss had butchered Ryan and cooked his flesh into the stew that they were devouring with such pleasure. Later that night, the men were awakened by a horrible whooping sound coming from outside their cabin. That was the first time the unearthly whoops were heard. It was a sound that would torment the crew boss for years. As the stories about the hooper spread, loggers refused to go anywhere near the area. One day, many years later, when this was one of the few remaining areas left to be logged, a lumberjack came across some bones an animal had dug up. They were human bones. And since the only person to have gone missing in the area was the young cook Ryan Garvin, it was concluded they were his remains. Everyone thought that if the remains were given a proper burial, the awful whooping might stop. The logging company, wanting to end the superstition, brought in a priest to perform the rites. But the whooping did not stop. Indeed, it may have gotten worse.
Grant them eternal rest, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. May they rest in peace. Amen.
Well, my grandfather was a logger for many years, and he used to tell us some pretty crazy stories, but the craziest would probably have to be about the Dungarvan Hooper. Well, the story starts off way back in the day with my grandfather playing some cards and having a few drinks with some fellow loggers of his, and he's losing badly to a rowdy drunk from Alberta, when all of a sudden they heard a loud whoop come from outside. So when they hear this noise getting louder and louder, trying to figure out what the whooping is, everyone's scared, except for this loud, obnoxious guy.
What's this?
It's the Hooper.
The what?
The Dungarvan Hooper. You never heard of the Dungarvan Hooper? You've heard of the Hooper.
No, I never heard of the Hooper.
It's the young camp cook Ryan. He was killed back in the 1800s by his crew boss. He still haunts the woods in this camp all around this area.
And that's what that noise is supposed to be?
Yes, that's him right now.
That was him now?
Yes, that was him.
And you guys believe that foolishness, do you? Oh, gosh.
The noise is so loud, it seems like it's right outside the door. So this loud, obnoxious guy, he figured, well, hey, you guys are all afraid of it. I'm going to go right outside and figure out what it is. So he just grabbed his whiskey bottle and heads out the door. He's still calling them all chickens, and he's even making fun of the whooping noise. He's just yelling back, just whooping at it.
Come. Yeah.
Come on out, guys. Come on. We gotta find the whooper. Come on, you bunch of chickens. Come on. Whoop, whoop. Come on, guys. Whoop, whoop, whoop.
And he's just venturing off darker and darker, and he's still whooping. And then all of a sudden the whooping stops, and he hasn't been seen since. So as the noise ends, everyone inside the cabin's trying to figure out, well, where's this loud, obnoxious guy? He just disappears like that. So they wanted to venture outside, but they didn't want to go too far. They didn't want to venture off into the woods because they don't even know where this whooping sound's coming from. So they waited till the next morning to figure out where their friend went to. And they ventured off outside into the daylight, and they found nothing. They found nothing at all. Except for his whiskey bottle. And still to this day, my grandfather swears that that night, that was the Dungarvan Hooper, that was hooping. He swears that that's what it was that everyone was afraid of. And that's how his friend disappeared. And still to this day, he will never go back there day or night.
What is it that the Dungarvan Hooper wants from those who hear his cries? Revenge? Justice? Or is his hooping a reminder to those who venture into the backwoods of New Brunswick of how far some might go for the taste of flesh, even human flesh?
Those were just some of the stories from Creepy Canada's Ghost Files. Join us next time for more. I'm Brian O'Day. Thanks for watching.